Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. This video is a brief overview of the more immediate causes of America's entry into World War II. This video is not going to focus as much on the Neutrality Acts or the events that occurred in Europe throughout the 1930s. This is looking at the factors in like 39, 40, and 41 that directly led to America entering the war. So just keep that in mind as we go on. We will, however, take a quick look at some of the more long-term causes of America's involvement in the war, although it's not really the focus of this video. In the 1930s, the Great Depression, combined with lingering cynicism over America's involvement in World War I, put those things together. Not a lot of people in America are incredibly excited about getting involved in another European or global conflicts. So Congress began passing a series of Neutrality Acts in 1935. The first two, passed in 35 and 36, outlawed loans to what were called belligerent nations, outlawed the sale of weapons to belligerent nations, so nations that are at war, officially at war. It also banned Americans from traveling on ships that were carrying weapons of any kind. The idea was to avoid another, Lusitania-type incident there. This begins to be strained over time, though, and neutrality sort of falls apart. In 1937, Japan, which had invaded part of China, Manchuria, in 1931, invades the rest of China and committed a lot of atrocities against Chinese civilians. And America instituted what was called a moral embargo at that time, whereby America was not selling many supplies at all to Japan, and really sort of limited the sale of oil too, although it didn't cut off oil entirely. In 1939, as the war in Europe ramped up with Hitler's invasion of Poland, and then him turning his sights on Great Britain, America instituted something called the cash and carry policy. And the cash and carry policy meant that America would sell weapons to belligerent nations on the condition that they paid cash for them. There would be no loans, and they had to carry them on their own ships. So takeout and not delivery, if you want to think about it that way. And technically this is still neutral because it was open to anyone. Any country could buy weapons from America as long as they paid cash and carried them on their own ships. But Great Britain is the country that pretty much controls the seas, so it's primarily going to benefit them. Just, makes sense. As things get worse for Great Britain during the Battle of Britain with, the bombings from the Nazis and Blitzkrieg and all of that, the U.S. gives 50 destroyers to the British military, and that's called the Destroyers for Bases deal. In return, America was able to set up naval bases on British-held territories such as Bermuda and Antigua and a lot of other areas in the Caribbean in particular. America also instituted a peacetime draft for the first time ever in 1940. So the Selective Service Act drafted about 1.2 million people into the military before America was even directly involved in the war. And that made isolationists very, very mad, but in hindsight really helped America be a little bit more prepared when war actually came. In 1941, when it was apparent that cash and carry wasn't doing enough to help Great Britain, America passed the Lend-Lease Act, which said that America could lend weapons and supplies to Great Britain, and in return America would be able to get land to operate off of militarily in various parts of the Atlantic. And this was intended just almost solely to help Great Britain. So if you look at this timeline here on this slide, you can see how neutrality just more or less goes away. And you see a very steady slide from being pretty much completely neutral to being very, very much pro-Britain. And that's going to ultimately culminate in America being directly involved in Europe as of early 1942. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Japan had really gone on the offensive throughout the Pacific even after they had invaded China in 1937. If you look at the map there in the background, the areas that are either shaded or circled in red were areas that were controlled by Japan as of September of 1939, when World War II began in Europe. By 1940 and 41, Japan controlled even more land than that, most notably French Indochina, which you can see right there. It's in purple right above the J in Japan on the heading. That's the area we would now call, today called Vietnam and Laos. That was taken over by Japan as well. And as it became more and more apparent that Japan was very much interested in creating an empire that spanned perhaps the entire Pacific Rim, the U.S. began to go on the offensive a little bit more, trying to limit Japan's ambition. So, in addition to what I mentioned in the previous slide about cutting off sale of supplies and stuff like that, they also began moving resources around on their own. So the U.S. naval fleet, which for the most part had been stationed on the coast of California and San Diego, began to be moved a little bit closer to Japan, to the Philippines, and as also to Pearl Harbor, which is in Oahu in Hawaii. And it was hoped that this, moving around of America's military forces closer to Japan would cause them to maybe think twice about continuing to, be the aggressor and taking these areas over. But that ends up not being the case. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, in 1941, Japan takes over Southeast Asia, French Indochina, and as a result of that, the U.S. did freeze all Japanese assets that were tied up in U.S. financial institutions and cut off sales of oil to Japan. And this is pretty big. This was almost seen as an act of war itself by Japan. Oil was incredibly crucial to them because they have a massive military operation. They have a lot of irons in the fire, both in the Navy and in their Air Force, and they need oil to power their boats and their planes. But Japan's not a very big country, and they don't have those resources available to be, produced at home. So they relied on oil exported by the United States. And so with that cut off, they're really kind of in a bind. And so it becomes necessary for them to begin looking to take over other parts of the Pacific they hadn't already hit. For example, the Philippines, where they could gain more natural resources. The only problem is the United States has a very significant naval presence in the Pacific, both in the Philippines and in Hawaii. So Japan realizes that if they're going to go on the offensive and begin taking over more areas for their resources, that they're going to have to do something to neutralize the American military presence in that region. And that's where the idea comes from to launch essentially a sneak attack on the United States naval assets in the Pacific. And the plan was hatched by Hideki Tojo, who's there on top. He was the Prime Minister of Japan. He's, as you can see there, part of the military, which was fairly common at that time in Japan because it was a very militaristic society at the time. And also by Isoroku Yamamoto, who is the naval admiral you see there on the bottom. And he was educated in the United States. Actually, he had been to the U.S. Naval War College for a time. And so sort of knew or had an idea what the Americans would do in response and all of that. And so he was sort of the mastermind behind the plan to attack Pearl Harbor. America knew the attack was coming, not average everyday people. The U.S. government knew there was going to be an attack by Japan. By the winter of 1941, America had cracked a lot of the Japanese codes, and so they knew something was coming because they had sort of intercepted some correspondence, but they thought it was going to be the Philippines because that's so much closer to Japan. They didn't think Hawaii was a viable target for the Japanese because it was so far out, but the Japanese managed. And on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, early in the morning, about 7 a.m. local time, a giant wave of Japanese fighter planes known as Zeros attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. And inflicted serious damage, which we'll look at in the next slide. The U.S. declared war on Japan the next day. That's when Franklin Roosevelt gives his famous speech saying it was a day that will live in infamy. And as a result of the U.S.'s declaration of war against Japan, Germany then declares war on the United States as per the alliance they had, the Tripartite Pact. And then America declares war on Germany too. So as a result of Pearl Harbor, America is not only at war with Japan, but is also involved in the war in Europe. And that two-front war is going to present some challenges, especially early on. This is just a partial accounting of the reign of ruin that the Japanese military was able to inflict on the United States Navy during the attack on Pearl Harbor. 2,403 American sailors were killed. Almost half of those were on the USS Arizona, which exploded in the harbor and sunk. And all but a very few of those who died, their bodies were never recovered and are still in the hull of the ship underwater in Pearl Harbor, which is what you see there in that bottom picture. That's a picture of the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor. About 1,100 people were wounded, 68 civilians, mostly people who were working for the military in some way, shape, or form, were killed. 2 battleships, the Arizona and the USS Oklahoma, were sunk and so damaged that they couldn't be salvaged at all. 2 other battleships, the USS West Virginia and the USS California, were sunk in the attack, but were not so damaged they couldn't be recovered. And by 1944, both of them were actually back in service after they were patched up, floated, renovated, and put back out to sea. And the USS California, I know, was in service until the late 50s, I think. So just because a ship was sunk at Pearl Harbor didn't mean it was completely gone. But again, this is a very partial list. Lots of submarines, lots of destroyers, lots of cruisers were taken out by the Japanese because the attack was so unexpected that there was really no resistance that the Americans were putting up, at least at first. And so the Japanese were just, blowing things to smithereens in the harbor, and there was really nothing that was stopping them because Americans weren't really manning the guns. The one lucky thing, if you could say that it's lucky, for the Americans during Pearl Harbor is most of the battleships were, not battleships, most of the aircraft carriers, the big ones, right? That's the 5-peg and battleship, like big ships. Those were out to sea. And so they weren't there to be attacked. And so if the carriers had been sunk in Pearl Harbor, you would have had major problems because you lose a lot of your attack capability for one thing, and you also may end up having the harbor blocked if something that big sinks in it, and then everything that's there, whether it was sunk or not, is totally useless for a while. And it took America a while, even after Pearl Harbor and after the carriers weren't there, to recover after the attack, because for the next 6 months, Japan just ran roughshod over the Pacific and took a whole bunch of stuff over, like the Philippines and a bunch of other islands, and America was more or less powerless to stop it. But eventually America does recover, starting with the Battle of Midway in 1942 and then on from there. But that's for another day if you're one of my students. That's all for now. Again, if you're one of mine, I'll put some stuff on Moodle, some links about the Pearl Harbor attack and some of the people who were involved, and some stuff on the Arizona Memorial, because it's really, really fascinating. So be on the lookout for that. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comment section below or ask in class. Cheers.